Welcome to the show. It's time to raise the bar for leaders and dreamers who know they'll go far. We're talking confidence, growth, and bold moves that stick. No fluff, just fire. I'm talking real change, real quick. So grab your goals and a little caffeine. Let's build the life you've seen in your dreams. This ain't just a podcast, it's fuel for your spark. Strap in, you're listening to Raise Your Own Bar.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in to the Raise Your Own Bar podcast. My name is Tamara Bucky. I'll be your host. And with me today, I've got a special guest all the way from across the pond in Portugal, Mr. Mike Blake. Mike is a specialist who helps businesses determine how much they are worth so they can prepare to be sold, and it's called business valuation. He also specializes in intellectual property, and I had the pleasure of meeting him in Atlanta a few years ago, where we both tried out for the funniest accountant competition. Welcome, Mike. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm great. How is Portugal?
Uh, it is phenomenal. I got to tell you, we moved here about 22 months ago, and it's one of the best decisions we ever made.
Wow, I love that. I hear you guys had some power issues the other day. Everything turned out okay with that?
Yeah, everything turned out fine. And for us, the blackout wound up being about 9 hours. It varied by region, but within a day, I think the entire Iberian Peninsula was back on the juice. So
Oh, good.
it was really just more confusing than anything else. More, certainly not dangerous for most people, more of a nuisance.
Yeah, well, we're so addicted to technology that 9 hours without it sounds a little scary sometimes.
Well, look, you and I are both from the South. We've had our share of hurricanes and tropical storms and ice storms where power's been out for multiple days. So in the greater scheme of things, 9 hours is not that big a deal. But the big deal was we didn't know why. As power was going out, but the cell phone system still worked for another 2 hours later because they have their own battery backups. I was getting information that London had lost power and the Netherlands and Germany had lost power. And that led me to think, oh my God, is this an attack? Like, did Putin finally lose his mind and push the button, or is this just a massive cyber attack on the continent? And thankfully, it turned out to be none of those things. But that was what made it scary. There was no apparent reason for it.
What caused it? Did they find out?
The Portuguese government says that there's a quote atmospheric disturbance, and if that sounds vague to you, you're right. It is vague. I have no idea what that means. The Spanish government, I think, as of today, had not yet released a formal statement as to what the cause was. It appears that there is a sudden change in sunlight in central Spain because Spain has a lot of solar power because they get a ton of sun. Portugal does a lot of wind. We're more wind than solar. We have a ton of wind, but Spain has a ton of sun. And if I understand correctly, and again, I'm not an engineer, but it seems that there is a sudden change in cloud cover, which overloaded the power system. And because of the nature of the way solar and wind works, it's very hard to kind of compensate for these big changes. And the way the power grids work is that they have to very carefully balance input of energy and output of energy. And if they go out of whack, you blow the entire system. And that's what happened here, apparently. But they're not being very forthcoming. So it's become a haven for conspiracy theories that even Alex Jones would probably find disturbing. So
Well, it sounds like BS to me right off the bat. I'm not gonna lie. The sun went away too quickly. There was too much cloud cover. I mean, okay, maybe. I'm not a scientist.
yeah, and I'm not either, but yeah, and there's no 15-second explanation that I can find, which is what makes me feel odd about it. Everything's a 25-minute YouTube video that walks you through electromechanics and like, we got to do better. And when you have that, that's what gives rise to conspiracy theorists that are, from Russian cyber attack to terrorism to, um, the government wanting to flex its muscle and demonstrate how much power it has, to somebody sabotaging the grid because they don't believe in alternative energy. I mean, it's bizarre.
Well, none of those things are out of the realm of possibilities, unfortunately. We live in a very weird world where conspiracies sometimes turn out to be true, and the craziest theories are facts. So you'll have to keep us posted on this. Thank you for sharing that because that was super interesting and glad I didn't have to deal with it because I have become very addicted to my technology. We had a outage the other day that lasted for about 5 hours, but it was only my house. It was, or I'm sorry, only my neighborhood. It wasn't like, all of Huntsville. There was, I think somebody hit a power line. But even that was a little bit of a challenge because I had stuff I wanted to do and I needed to be on the computer and I needed the internet. And so that was kind of a pain. But at the same time, I've been finding myself unplugging more and more these days to just allow myself to just interact with people in real life, get out in nature, and get off of technology. And I think there is some balance to be struck.
Well, there certainly is. I mean, one of the things that the outage did, I think, demonstrate is how dependent we are upon electricity. You know, I was the source of local information because I had a battery powered shortwave radio, right? And a lousy one at that. In fact, I wound up upgrading it because I wasn't happy with the performance. But um, without internet, people were paralyzed. They had no access to information. Your cell phone was basically just a very expensive paperweight. So, you know, nobody says we should plug in more, that's for sure. But at a minimum, it is causing us here to rethink what kind of backup systems do we need to have, because if the world is that digital, being connected from it can be scary. And I'll reiterate, the last thing that I heard before my cell phone went dead was that the UK, Germany, Netherlands were all without power, which in what left in my mind, is this an attack? Is this World War III?
Yeah.
Now, in 10 minutes, I realized, okay, Lisbon's still here. So it's not nuclear World War III, but without access to information, that was sort of the last thing I had. And we all had to guess, as opposed to you're in Atlanta, you're in Huntsville, a tornado rips through a substation, or you get a hurricane that comes through, the power loss is likely going to happen. You know why it's going to happen. And depending on the damage, it may take several days for the grid to come back in. But with something like that, where you just didn't know, and it could have been a cyber attack,
Yeah.
cyber attack sometimes takes several days to recover from. And we just didn't know. And even once we got on radio, there really wasn't a lot of useful information.
We are addicted to information in a way. Used to be we didn't find things out until we turned on the news, but now we have it right at our fingertips. And so to go without that, especially in a time where you don't know what's going on, that's got to be pretty scary, especially if you are, a parent, maybe your kids are at school or somewhere else and you don't have any way to communicate. So I bet this was eye-opening for a lot of people to start thinking about their emergency preparedness in the future.
For sure. And we are too. Um, we're we're going to invest in a solar backup system for our condo, and we're probably going to get a Starlink system so that we have internet access. Again, and like I said, upgraded my shortwave radio right away. So and I'm not the only one. I'm not a guy with a tinfoil hat or anything. So a lot of people have lost a lot of faith in the grid, even though nothing like this has really happened before here. But because of the lack of the explanation, there's nothing to give people comfort that this won't happen again tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But to their credit, at least they're not just putting a band-aid on it and trying to appease people without really, giving them answers. At least they're telling us we don't know and we're going to need to investigate further. So, well, it's always an adventure in this life.
Yes.
So, I just got to ask you, Why Portugal? Why did you pick up and move all the way to Portugal? It's beautiful, but what was the drive?
So it's a long story that I'm going to try to condense as much as I can. But it's not what a lot of people think. A lot of people think, oh, you must have left because of politics in the US. Like, no, that's not it. I'm still an American citizen. I will keep my passport. Um, but the reason why is because I have a talent for learning languages, for assimilating into foreign cultures. And I've known I've had that since I was in junior high school. And that's a big reason why my first jobs out of college were in Eastern Europe when I lived over there. And I missed it. And I always thought that there'd be some opportunity that would bring me back to Europe and would give me an opportunity to engage that part of my life again. And it never did. And Atlanta's a great city, but frankly, being a polyglot, being somebody who has the talents that I have is just not very useful there. And it was a bar trick. Say something in Ukrainian, so I do, and then just sort of move on. That's not very rewarding.
Yeah.
So it was starting to depress me because imagine if the things you knew that you were best at just weren't being used, weren't being applied, weren't being shared with the world.
Yeah.
And finally, my wife and I were walking our dog, and I said, I want to move to Europe. And she says, great. And she goes, when do you want to go? And then I said, when do you want to go? Do you want to wait until I retire? Or do you want to go now? And she said, I'll burn the house down for the insurance money and we can move yesterday. So she was all on board. And then we spent a lot of time looking across Europe, trying to figure out what country would be the best place for me to move to. And then also kind of cross matching that with the countries that will have us, because you could want to move to any place you want, but if you can't get a visa, then it doesn't matter. And long story short, after a lengthy search process, we settled on Portugal, where we discovered that it was just a place that we just fit. It felt natural. We were making friends right away. And the transient friendships that we made during our scouting visits held over to when we moved. And like I said, it's been a phenomenal experience. And I'll share with you some inside baseball that you'll appreciate. So the comedy competition that we were in, and you won, and I didn't, to put it mildly, the day after we left to go to Portugal on a 3.5 week scouting trip,
Oh, wow.
and we didn't tell anybody. And the reason we didn't tell anybody was because I had to test whether or not I could really do business there. And the only way to get an honest answer was to just see if it were transparent, right? So I didn't tell my colleagues, I didn't tell my partners. They were less than thrilled about that. No friends, no family, total social media embargo, right? So right after that competition, we finished packing. Next day, we're on a plane to Portugal. And that was, but again, that was necessary because when people would call me at 10 at night, local time, 5 o'clock Atlanta time, I just answer the phone and I'd get on Zoom calls and I just make sure the sun wasn't up in the background when it was supposed to be, or night wasn't up when it was supposed to be. And nobody had any idea. When we came back 3.5 weeks later, nobody had any idea I was out of the country at all, that I'd even been out of town. And that's
Wow.
when we knew that we could pull the trigger and make this work.
That's amazing. Wow. That competition was a lot of fun.
It was fun. I learned so much, and I still think about it because the learning from it continues, right? I watch stand-up comedy now in a totally different way. I think that if you don't understand comedy, you think that a Jim Gaffigan gets up there and is just funny, and it's not. stand-up comedy I learned is very much like acting. And there's an acting component to it. And my only regret is, well, I have no regrets. Um, and I may do it again. I may do it again because I think I learned a lot from that process, of how I could do better next time.
A lot about writing jokes or being humorous, or what do you mean?
All of it, all of it. I don't think my jokes didn't land. Um, the timing was off, and it wasn't because I was nervous. I performed as a musician on stage all the time. I'm not afraid of the microphone. I just didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I didn't know how to write. I didn't know how to rehearse. They're honest all the time about rehearsing, and I'm not sure I rehearsed enough because I just had a lot of things going on, including preparing for that trip.
Yeah.
But I don't think I rehearsed correctly,
Mm.
because my routine was not smooth. It didn't come out the way that I wanted to, and but it wasn't for lack of effort. I just don't think I knew what the hell I was doing.
It's definitely an art and a science. Like
Yeah.
the process matters, but also things happen naturally based on what your gifts are. I've got the gift of gab. It doesn't always translate right on the stage because on with when it comes to doing stand up, you have to be very strategic with how you place your words and how you say them, and the pause is just as important as saying something. So yeah, it's definitely an art and a science. But kudos to you for doing it, stepping completely outside of your comfort zone and trying something new. And you may not have won, but I mean, you made it to the top five, so that's a huge achievement. I think there was over 100 people that tried out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was proud of the achievement, no regrets. I don't think I embarrassed myself. But I wasn't booed off the stage or anything. It was, the fact that you'd done it before, and in fact, in that final five, I think I was the only person who'd never been on stage doing stand up before. Um, and there's probably a lesson in that too, that I'm probably better at improv than
Mm,
I am at like a prepared stand up bit. But again, I learned so much. I thought we were in a great group that was mutually supportive.
yes.
Nobody was rooting for anybody to fail, that's for sure. At least not that I could tell. Um, we were all sort of in that together. It's just, the way I think about it now is like, okay, I learned a ton from this. I want to apply what I learned just to see if next time I can do better, whenever that is. But unfortunately, they shut down the competition. You were
Yeah.
so good, they're not doing it anymore. There's no point
Yeah.
in continuing.
I'm really sad that they shut it down. There was supposed to be a 20-year anniversary show, and I think they just fell on hard times with the company, and so they had to restructure and do some layoffs and things like that. So I'm just grateful for the experience that I had, and it was a cool way to bridge for me the serious side of my work and the funny side of me. So it was kind of a match made in heaven for me.
Do you find that you're using that in your work?
Oh yeah.
How so?
Well, I teach a lot. I conduct training, and I always add comedy throughout the presentation. I've become more strategic about adding it though than I used to be in the past. And used to be I would just kind of do improv as it came up, but now I actually build in, like probably every 4 slides or something, I will plan for a joke because humor helps people remember the content. It helps people remember you, and it helps people connect with things in a different way because a lot of times training is it's boring. It makes you, maybe it's not something you want to do, even if the topic is interesting. But when you're allowed to just relax and laugh, it feels like entertainment. So you're more likely to take it in and not resist it. And you're really going to actually relax and have fun with it. And I think
You know, I,
scientifically too, there's data that supports if there is humor involved, then you're more likely to remember anything that you learned as a participant.
I don't know the science behind that, but I think it makes sense. If you're teaching material that's kind of dry, it's kind of like trying to get a kid to eat vegetables, right? You put some broccoli, steamed broccoli in front of them, it's not going to happen. But you put a nice little cheese sauce on it or something, and next thing you know, the broccoli's all gone. And I think humor has a role to play with education in that way. It probably activates a part of the brain that makes the neural pathways more enduring.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I've been using it as it's part of my value proposition. As a business, I bring humor to the table. And so if I'm conducting a training, if I'm doing a workshop, anything of that nature, I make sure to share that's going to be my approach. And oftentimes they're excited about it. Clients love that.
Yeah, I think, well, it's refreshing. You settle in for training. Some of the people in your room may not be there voluntarily. Um, or at a minimum, they may be distracted. They're stressed about what they're not doing while they're in the training. And I think, humor breaks down barriers. It's probably one of the most difficult things about being in a foreign country in a foreign language is my language ability is not really up to the
Mm.
task of being humorous yet. Um, Once in a blue moon, I'll sort of get a joke across and that lands, but I'm still at a pretty basic level. So I'm not doing Portuguese stand up or anything, but that it limits the way you communicate.
Is there a scene? Is there a stand-up comedy scene in Portugal?
There is. There's a place near us that has an open mic night for comics. So I may gin up. Now, again, it's not about ginning up the comedy. It's about now that I realize what's involved in preparing to do a bit, I got to find the time to actually do it.
Yeah.
But also, American comics do come through here. So Michelle Wolf is playing Lisbon, I think sometime in May, actually. So
Very cool. Well, if you ever want to, I'm in a writer's room once a week where it's all for funny writers. Some of them do comedies, some do scripts, sketches, music. We've got a poet in there too that's writing a funny poetry book. But it's part of the How to Write Funny group that's owned by Scott Dickers, the guy who was one of the co-founders of The Onion, and it's great. I mean, I'm facilitating, but I also share my material and we just help each other. We share about 5 minutes of material and then we'll take another 5 minutes to hash it out. People give recommendations, they give their initial thoughts, feedback, ideas on how to make it better, ideas on words to say instead. And it's really leveled up my comedy in a lot of ways. So if you ever want to come, I'll invite you as my guest. And then if you wanted to officially join, you certainly could.
I appreciate that. I might do that. You know what I fantasize my bit would be about? It would actually be very meta. It would be about being in the competition because there were so many funny things about it. Um, there was, of course, we had one person that just refused to go clean in her humor, right? And so she just sort of bailed. And I thought that was
That
that was
was
kind of funny.
interesting. Yeah.
And I was much older than everybody else. I was at least 10 to 15 years older, I think, than everybody in our cohort. And I thought, I think there's some humor there. But the other part too is as I'm developing, my wife said you got to develop material based on your own life experiences. But I don't know how comics like talk about their friends and family and their bits. Like I'm not gonna, how do you talk about and make jokes about your wife or your kids that are sitting there in the audience, and my parents are going to watch the thing on streaming at some point down the road. It's like, well, there goes my marriage, or there's 5,000 hours of therapy I got to pay for, or there goes my inheritance, right? So I don't know how comics do it, but that whole thing about that entire experience, I think, can be a bit. And if I were going to do it again, I'd come to the writer's room to kind of turn my experience in the comedy show to a bit.
Yeah. Well, for me, I had to learn the hard way that you need to get permission. Uh, I upset my mom with some jokes one time that she got
Ooh.
to see on YouTube instead of warning her about them. And she was not pleased at all.
Yeah.
So I ended up taking the jokes down and I had to promise not to talk about certain things. And pretty much what I do is I just run material by her. If I have any jokes about my family, I give her a heads up and she'll tell me like that's acceptable or no, that's not acceptable. And I respect her enough to, to abide by her wishes. And then my boyfriend, he thinks it's great. And a lot of times we roast each other. I had a roast for my 40th birthday, which was 3 years ago. And he was the MC and he's a musician. So he's a ham,
Yeah.
but he's never done comedy. But when he was the roast meister, he got the comedy bug, and now he hasn't stopped roasting me for 3 years. So anything goes with him. I'll say anything about Andrew.
That's important, is to have a thick skin.
Yeah, for sure. But humor brings us together um, in ways that like there's a few things that cut across all of the barriers when it comes to commiserating with other human beings. Breaking bread is absolutely one. Grief, I think, is another one, and then humor, because you don't have to have the same language to grieve together, to eat together, or to laugh together. And so much comedy happens without language, just by watching things unfold, or slapstick comedy. You think about some of those silent films that were hilarious because they were just slapstick. So I think it's a way to bring people together. And then, of course, chemically in your brain, um, when you're laughing, you're releasing feel-good hormones, oxytocin, serotonin. These things make you feel happy. So it's a win-win all around.
Well, I think on some level it also eases suffering. Um, in the
Yeah.
USSR, and this again shows my dating myself, but in the USSR, there was an underground satirical magazine called The Crocodile. And it was all essays and political and satirical essays and political cartoons about life in the USSR, because of course free speech was totally repressed, and the Russians were not playing around when they repress you. So that was their outlet. But they had jokes that gave you insight into what life was like, and it was that shared experience that I think made people think they weren't alone.
Yeah.
Um, I still remember one joke where it shows a couple waking in bed. They've been startled awake, and the wife says to the husband, "Don't worry, it's not the police, it's just burglars."
Oh my.
Right? Which
Dark
again,
humor.
that's classic Russian satirical humor.
Yeah. So did you live in the USSR?
I lived in the former Soviet Union. I did visit the USSR in 1988. So I did a high school trip in Moscow and Leningrad back
Oh,
then.
wow.
And then I won a scholarship to do a summer in Moscow in 92. Then I lived in Belarus from 93 to 95, and then Ukraine from 95 to 97.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I did not know all this about you, Mike. How cool. So you are a polyglot then. You probably speak all of those different Slavic languages plus a few more.
I don't speak Belarusian really, but I do speak Russian. I'm not speaking it right now because of the war, but I do speak Ukrainian and a few others. So Portuguese is language number 6.
So Portuguese is what? It's similar to, it's a Romance language, right? Is it similar to Spanish?
It is. Um, I say if French and Spanish had a love child, Portuguese would be the result. The grammar is very close to Spanish.
Hmm.
The vocabulary borrows heavily from Spanish, but the pronunciation is very French.
Interesting. Okay. So when you say a polyglot, I mean, are you fluent? Like,
I don't use the word fluent because if when you learn languages, that's a dangerous word. I don't even say that I'm fluent in English necessarily. What I will say is this: is I can hold almost any conversation in Russian, Ukrainian, or French without a translator. And then I can have most social conversations in Spanish and Portuguese. But I wouldn't, like when healthcare is involved, I switch to English unless I have no choice. Right? That's just too important to misunderstand, right? Or if it's a big government or legal discussion, then I'm going to have a translator. But on a day-to-day basis, meeting people in the street, having conversations about the weather, daily life, what I do for a living, that sort of thing, then I can do that. So I say I speak it on a useful level.
What was your second language?
French.
Okay. Mine too. Well, unless you count Spanish that I learned just like in the streets in LA.
Uh, a lot of people in the language community will get bent out of shape about what does it mean to actually learn a language. I think that if you learn a word of a foreign language, you've learned some way of communicating in a foreign language. And the reason why I don't like to use the word fluent is because it it implies mastery,
Mm,
and uh, all of all languages are so complex. Very few people truly mastered even a native language, um, and so it's just really to me, it's just really about are you accomplishing what you want with the language?
yeah. Can you actually convey a message and be understood and have two-way communication? That's really what matters.
Yeah, and for me, what I enjoy about it is it helps me meet people where they are. So, I first my first taste of that, I spoke French. My parents took me on a trip to Europe in 1986, and they couldn't, they didn't speak French. I did, so I was their translator. And candidly, the French were blown away that this kid was communicating with them on this level, because the French were like, "Oh God, I speak English again." And the fact that they didn't have to. And you talk about a dopamine hit, man. When people are telling you all the time that you can speak a little bit of their language, you're like a goat on roller skates. That is a dopamine hit. Um, and then you go to a place like Russia where, you know, they do not expect you to speak Russian, or Belarus, even more so. The only English speakers there are teachers and diplomats and spies. Um, and when you can meet people where they are, um, it lights them up. It lights up the pleasure centers of their brain, I'm guessing, and it makes them feel seen. And I
Yeah.
haven't really said anything of consequence. It's just it's just the fact that I bothered to try. And the same thing with Ukrainian. Ukraine and Russia have always had a very troubled relationship, and Ukrainian as a language has always had a um, sort of a second class status.
Mm,
And again, the fact that I spoke Ukrainian, not Russian, I didn't expect them to speak Russian. Again, meeting people where they are, and I see the same thing in Portugal. It just delights them because they no longer have to pay a price of admission to talk to you. They can speak on their own terms. Even if
yeah.
they have to be slower and simpler than they normally would be, it's still easier than trying to do it in the foreign language.
Yeah, actually that makes so much sense. And I have I had an experience that you made me think of, um, where I was in, I forget where I was. Oh, I believe I was in Germany. I lived in Germany for a few years and it was when I first moved there. And I was trying to essentially find somebody that could translate for me. And somebody just told me they spoke English. They told me their English was not very good, but it was better than everybody else because we were in an area that just did not have many English speakers, versus where I lived, which was full of English speakers in the Rhineland-Pfalz state. And so it feels like a lifeline when you, especially if you need help, which we did, to find somebody that can actually communicate with you. Not only are you seen, but I mean, it feels like your connection to the world in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. At least my experience has been um, when you have access to other languages, you have access to other people, you have access to other information, you have access to different ways of approaching life. And I understand Google Translate's a great tool. I use it all the time. Um, and Chat GPT is pretty good, but it is nowhere near a substitute for person to person communication.
Yeah. Do they use ChatGPT much? Are they as big on AI over there in Portugal as we seem to be in the US?
Um, I I think they're maybe a little behind, maybe 6 months behind
Hmm.
where we are. But Portugal is not, frankly, it's not as developed an economy as the United States or much of Europe. So the answer is it's probably not as big a deal here. But that having been said, there's a sneaky little good AI technology sector in Lisbon,
Hmm.
due in no small part to the fact that Google has a research center here, Microsoft has a research lab, and this is something that's underappreciated. Many of the transatlantic uh, data cables that bring internet over fiber between the US and Europe terminate in Lisbon or in Portugal, which
Hmm.
means we have super fast data.
Nice. So they really run these cables in the water, like under the ocean
Oh
floor, or
yeah.
what?
Oh yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these cables that the Russians keep cutting, I mean, they're real. They are definite assets, and satellites cannot possibly carry all the data that we need to send back and forth.
Wow. We definitely need to figure out a way to secure data and technology and communication access in general, because God forbid an adversary wants to do harm, and cutting the communication is really, it can really freak people out. And I don't, circling back to the start of our conversation, I don't think UK and Germany actually did lose power that day, did they? Was that
No, they
just a
didn't.
rumor?
That was just a rumor. That's
Yeah,
correct.
that's what I was thinking. So when rumors abound and people are saying crazy stuff and you have zero way of validating or invalidating it, it makes fear swell.
Absolutely. And so my posture in terms of protecting my family was, we need to be prepared to be without power for a week.
Yep.
Because if this really is a cyber attack, it's not just run an antivirus and reboot the system. A cyber attack of that magnitude is a multi-day exercise if you're lucky, and if everything goes exactly right.
Yeah.
So, and we live in a condo, we don't live in a house. So we had to, what if the gas goes out? What if the water goes out, right? We got to have several days supply of water and a charcoal grill and a solar generator and all that stuff. So yeah, you got to think that. And fortunately, my sense is I think NATO is now taking that seriously. I read that NATO is now patrolling where our cables are,
Hmm.
and we haven't had a cable cut in a long time now, and I think a message has been sent to Russia that the next the next ship that accidentally cuts one of our cables is going to be accidentally sunk.
Yeah, I can't blame anybody for that. It's interesting with this war going on, well, two wars going on really, Russia and Ukraine, as well as Israel and Hamas, that you realize how tentative everything really is, and it makes you appreciate the good things in life, the things that we take for granted a lot of times. I don't know what the solution is, but I can't help but feel like we're all one. We all come from the same, you know, consciousness, or whatever you want to say. We're all of the same tribe, so to speak. So fighting amongst ourselves seems really dumb and a waste of time and energy. But this quest for power that people get on, I think it's just part of humanity, and I don't know what the solution is to it, because I was just having a conversation with a friend last night about two different things, the Stanford experiment and the Milgram experiment. Are you familiar with both of those?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So it really just made me feel kind of disheartened because the people that get into positions of power might have good intentions, but they often get corrupted. And then, of course, people that are corrupt seek power. And because of their personality types, usually narcissistic, sociopathic type people, they get into power and then they stay. They don't want to relinquish it. So, how do we fix humanity, Mike?
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think my personal mantra for many years has been care, serve, and forgive. And I think that if people adopted a mantra similar to that, then I think we could figure these things out. You know, the Ukraine-Russia war is very different from the Israeli war against Hamas and quote unquote Palestine. It's not recognized that way, but that's what it is. You know, I don't understand either. I don't understand either one of them. The only thing I do understand, I understand the Russia-Ukraine one a little bit better. I understand that two countries that should be close friends are going to be mortal enemies for the next 100 years at least
Mm,
because of that. I can tell you there's uh, a Ukrainian refugee center in the city where we settled, has about 300 people, and it's women and children, right? All the men are either dead or were not allowed to leave because they're subject to conscription. And even hearing the Russian language is traumatizing to them. And you know, sadly, history has shown Russia never leaves a place better than where they found it. Nobody's ever sad to see the Russians leave,
mm.
ever. Um, and that's just been their doctrine since Ivan the Terrible, at least. And you, there was no reason for this war. There was no realistic path for Ukraine to join NATO, and even if it did, Ukraine is holding Russia to a standstill with our Army Navy surplus stuff and a few Patriot missile systems. Um, if NATO really wanted to, if NATO really had aggressive designs against Russia, Russia would have no defense other than nuclear weapons.
Mm.
Um, but they don't realize that. So I don't know, man. Care, serve, and forgive.
I love that motto. I absolutely love that motto. Care, serve, and forgive. Something that we often forget in our hustle and bustle. And I know living in Europe, maybe it might help. I'm guessing it does help because I just found Europe to be a lot more relaxed than the United States. I was really thick into the rat race in my early 20s before I moved to Germany. And thank God I did because I can only imagine what kind of person I would be today. But over there, I was forced to slow down. They actually close up shop and take a vacation with their family. And they have, or at least in Germany, they had quiet time during certain parts of the day where you can't do yard work with the mower. Like you're expected to relax.
I mean, the mechanics are different, but it's certainly a similar ethos. You know, America, and this is neither good or bad, by the way, but America as a society solves for income and efficiency. Those are two things we want out of, generally speaking, as a society. That's what we solve for. In Europe, they solve for wellness, and um, they solve for compassion.
Mm,
They generally speaking, they do measure their society's achievements by the status of its weakest members, whereas America measures its success by the success of its most successful people. So Europe measures its success by how high the floor is.
mm,
America measures its success by how high the ceiling is. And there's no right or wrong answer, but there is a choice to be made.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting to think about. But you're right. America, the United States, does measure based on its big successes because it will just pretend everything else doesn't exist and we're going to focus on this positive thing. And if we were to focus instead on, the weakest link, so to speak, you're only as strong as your weakest link, that phrase resonates with people because it's true. And I would love to see the United States take a different vibe towards supporting the homeless, supporting people that are sick, addicted, destitute. And now we've got this refugee crisis. I mean, there's just so many things that we need to focus on rather than going around and flexing our muscles and pretending like we're great. Because while we do have greatness and we've done some great things, we also have a lot of dirt that we're trying to sweep under the rug and a lot of things that need to be cleaned up in our own backyard.
Well, we do. Um, and look, I'm not at all progressive, but I guess you could say I'm on the spectrum. Um, but you know, what we see going on in the United States, I think, is a symptom of something much deeper. And I have a lot of compassion for it. The in many ways, perpetrators are themselves victims.
Mm.
And we globalized back in the 1990s, oddly under a Democratic administration. And I was all for globalization. I'm an economist. I believe in free trade. I know how the math works. But but we didn't do what, for example, Germany did when they had reunification. When Germany reunified, they didn't say, well, East Germany, you're on your own, even though you're 40 years behind the rest of us. Figure out a way to catch up. They made massive investments to pull Eastern Germany up to the living standard of Western Germany. And Germans would tell you that process is still ongoing 30 years later. Um, we needed to do that in the United States. We have a lot of people that lost their jobs, not just to China, but also to technology. We're going to bring jobs back to the United States. Most of them are going to be done by robots. I don't know what people are going to do when they find that out.
Yeah.
But the core issue is that we sold them out. We sold a lot of people out for cheaper TVs
Yep.
and cheaper furniture,
And
and we
clothes.
did nothing, and clothes, whatever, name it, right? And we did nothing to help them, to help the people that are displaced by that.
Yeah.
So I understand why and for 30 years, nobody talked to them because the Democratic Party that used to be their advocate abandoned them.
Mm.
And so, the Democratic Party right now looks like the party of Reagan, and the Republican Party is the party of Trump, but they won a lot of the working class vote because although I don't think Donald Trump makes much sense, he's the only person in the room even acknowledging that working class America got screwed.
Yeah.
And so um, I understand why they're frustrated. I understand why there's anger. And I think that we as elites have a lot to answer for, and there needs to be an adjustment to our society. Um, but I don't think we've identified the disease to some extent, but we're not applying the right medicine.
Yeah. It's really sad when I see, like, my mom lives in Ohio, and there are towns that used to be hustling and bustling. Like the little tiny town that she lives in has a population of 326 people.
Yep.
At one time, it had over 12,000 people, and it was on the route of there's a train track that goes through there. And so at one time, there was a lot of trade taking place in that town. And I saw pictures from back in the day, and now it looks like a ghost town by comparison. And that happens all over. Ohio is one place that has really been devastated by the loss of manufacturing that happened in the 90s with NAFTA and all of these other the agreements with China that Clinton negotiated. And when you have a town that everybody loses their jobs and there is no retooling, you're not going to learn a new trade. There's literally nothing to do. Like these people would have to, and often they did, pick up and move to an entirely new place so that they can afford to feed their families. And it is devastating. And those
And
cities exist all over this country.
yeah, and they're so underwater in their homes that Aquaman lives there, right? So they can't move if they want to.
Yeah.
So we as a society didn't do nearly enough to help the people hurt by globalization to transition, and we are all paying a price for it. We set the stage for a Donald Trump because he he's he's filling an unmet political need, unfortunately. And now
Mm.
it seems increasingly clear that we're all gonna pay a price for it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, most people end up suffering at the hands of a few in leadership. So it's not unusual, but I'm still hopeful. I'm trying to look at things as positively as I can, and lately that means staying off of Facebook, staying off of the news. I used to have a radio show where I talked about the news, and I had to stop. It was getting to the point where it was really harming my mental health.
Hmm.
And so taking a break from that has really been good for me. But I still hold out hope. And the reason why is despite everything that's happening on the news, despite how divided we are according to the media, when I go out in the real world and I meet people of all colors and creeds and nationalities and countries of origin, they're good people. There are good people everywhere in this world. And so I want to nurture those relationships and I want to build with those people in real life right here where I can versus, hating people because they're different or focusing on myself and that's why I really love your motto, care, serve, give, forgive, because we need more of that. We really do. We need it at a local level.
Winston Churchill, who understood America as well as any European ever did, once said that America always does the right thing, but only after it tries everything else.
Mhm.
So, I think we're in a reset. Um, I'll tell you what, one thing we do need to get back is we need to get back the ability to debate.
Yes.
Um, Americans have lost the skill of debating. And the fact of the matter is, not everything Donald Trump and the MAGA movement says is wrong. I'm willing to have a conversation about immigration. I don't particularly want Salvadorian prisons to be involved, and I don't particularly want it to be outside of due process. But okay, an immigration system that is controlled and sensible, um, like other countries have, sure, okay. Um, I'm willing to have a conversation about government efficiency. We have a massive government deficit that must be addressed.
Yeah.
Um, but I would like it to be addressed through the proper channels. We have a Congress for a reason. We have a tax code for a reason. We have courts for a reason. Um, I'm willing to entertain a conversation about tariffs, but again, the way that they were done to me makes no sense. And 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 the incivility the incivility that's been created through much of our society has been the loss of the ability to debate, which includes being able to control your emotions when somebody says something that upsets you,
Yeah.
which means that which means that we should defend to the death the right for people to say awful things or things that we think are awful.
I agree with that. I'm a free speech absolutist myself. And even the most ugliest, hateful thing that somebody could say to me, I still support their right to be able to say it, even though I don't like them and I don't like what they say. But that's me. I'm more of a libertarian, but even more than that, a federalist. I take it all the way back to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that's where I really think we need to go as a country, because you're absolutely right. People can't debate and they won't. And ego is a big part of it. I think a lot of people are being driven by their egos, and they will dismiss people like, I don't like who you support, so I'm not even going to speak to you. I'm not even going to give you the time of day, even though that person might even be their family member or their coworker or their next door neighbor. And to me, there is nothing on this earth that is worth fighting with my neighbor and family about when it doesn't even affect me in real time. Like politics, yes, it affects all of us because there are policies that affect our life and the economy. But people get so wrapped up and cut people out of their lives just because of their beliefs. And I can't get on board with that. When this, we were building up to the election, it got so toxic on social media, and I had to stop following people. I had to mute people. I ended up getting off of it altogether back in November, actually, because it was just so ugly. And I had one friend that reached out to me, and they're like, I can't believe you allow people on your page to say these things. And I'm like, look, I support freedom of speech, and I'm telling you, it doesn't affect you as much as you think you do. Like, just enjoy your life. Go have fun and don't talk politics. We used to be told you don't talk about politics and you don't talk about religion. Well, I think we should. I think we absolutely need to learn how to talk about politics and religion with a sense of caring, because everybody's beliefs are valid to them. And even if I don't agree, I will respect your right to believe what you believe.
Well, you also cut yourself off from the opportunity to persuade.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And, but the prevailing view right now seems to be, the other side just has to come to their senses.
Never going to
Well,
happen.
how do you expect that? What's going to change? How do you expect that to happen unless there's a confronting viewpoint that is persuasive? And by the way, isn't centered around telling people that they're idiotic or stupid or whatever. No adult is going to listen to you the second you start name calling them.
Yeah.
So, but it's dueling third graders.
Well, and it's sad because you're never going to come to a solution. You're never going to be able to have real communication and solve the problem. And we've gotten to a point where feelings matter more somehow than reality. And back when I was a child of the 80s, I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Sticks and stones break my bones, but words can't hurt me. Like, these are things we need to bring back to society. We really do. And it
You
makes me
got my
sad.
vote. If you're in for office, you got my vote.
I always wanted to be a politician, but I decided it was way too corrupt and too much of a circus. So no, I am definitely not interested. But it really makes me sad because I'm seeing families fracture.
Mhm.
I'm seeing friend groups fracture, and we can live in a fractured society. Sure, we can have two different groups that don't communicate and don't work together. But, I used to work in the government for over a decade, and I will never forget this lesson. My old boss sent me on an assignment to the Middle East, and I was scared. I didn't want to go, but I was the point person. I had to. And when I came back, I said I felt like I was in my enemy's house the entire time. I couldn't relax. But he's like, but did you get the job done? And I said, yeah, I did. And he goes, good. This is a good lesson for you because you're great at building alliances with people that are your friends. But if you want to get real work done, you have to build alliances with people that are your enemies.
Yeah.
And I really had an eye-opening lesson with that. And that was probably 15 years ago, and it really has stuck with me. You have to build with your enemies. And until Americans figure that out, we're going to continue this infighting.
Unfortunately, I'm forced to agree.
Also, not everybody's your enemy. I mean, just because we don't agree doesn't mean that you're actually our enemy, my enemy. We have a lot of things in common and overlap if we could just talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, some people can have enemies. If you have somebody that is is trying to take away your rights, for example, then I think you can call them an enemy because they are
Yes.
actively trying to injure you.
Yeah.
Um, as a Gen X white male, I really can't say I have enemies. I have opponents, but I don't have enemies.
Mm.
Nobody's trying to take my rights away. Nobody's trying to nobody's trying to harm me. They're pursuing policies which I think are harmful,
Hmm.
but I don't nobody's putting their nobody credible is putting their crosshairs in my head.
That's a good way to think of it. Instead of enemy, it's opponent.
Yep.
I like that. I like that a lot. Well, Mike, this has been a really great conversation. I enjoy just hearing from how other people think and act and what they're doing out in the world. So before we wrap, is there anything that you want to share? Any advice to anyone that's looking to maybe try living in Europe or flex their muscles in a different field, like you did with the funniest accountant competition?
If I have, starting really with the funniest accountant and then a series of events that came after that, I learned how important it is to live in what I call Zod. And that only happens to sound like General Zod from Superman, but living in the zone of discomfort,
Mm,
living in the, one of the most valuable and rewarding things you can do is live in a zone of discomfort. Because if you can do that, one, it builds muscle and calluses, but also it often leads to victory if you can just simply live in discomfort longer than somebody else can.
mm.
I've won a lot of negotiations simply because I was willing to sit in a zone of discomfort longer than the other person was.
I love that. And it's so absolutely true because when you're uncomfortable, that's when you're growing.
Yep. That's when you're growing and potentially winning.
Yes, yes. And definitely just experiencing because it's all about the experience. Well, Mike, thank you so much. This has been awesome. For anyone that may want to follow your company and perhaps find out more about what you do with your business high score strategies, where can they follow you or find out more?
So I'm easy to find on social media. It's at Unbreakable on LinkedIn and Facebook. I have a YouTube channel called Your Business Value, and website is highscorestrategies.com. So I'm not hard to find.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time at such an early hour in Portugal to spend with us and really keep doing what you're doing because you are an inspiration to many people, Mike.
Thank you for having me on. It was a fun conversation.
Awesome. Have a good one.
You too.